Hey guys, Ryan here at Signature Edits, and inside of this Lightroom tutorial, we're going to be talking about editing sunsets. And the reason we're talking about that is because, well, I kind of felt like editing some sunset photos, and I was thinking to myself, man, these are the hardest things to edit. Normally, during the day, you don't have so much dynamic range, but a sunset photo is unique because there's super dark shadows and super bright highlights, and actually getting the colors to look the way you want can be really, really tricky, because by the time you actually get enough saturation and vibrance going on, it just looks like a weird kind of mess. So what are the tips and tricks that I can share with you today that will help you edit better sunset photos? Well, you're going to have to watch the intro and then we'll get into it. All right, so we're going to talk about editing sunset photos, but first things first, if you want to edit along with me, all of these raw files I'm using are actually available on signatureedits.com in the free raw files section. So you can go through, grab these files for yourself for free, and edit them, share on Instagram, and tag at #SignatureEditsCo, hashtag free raw files, so I can see what kind of awesome edits you're dreaming up. All right, with that out of the way, let's talk sunset photos. The first thing that I have found is really helpful is starting with a raw file. Well, basically start with a raw file rather than using a JPEG, because raw files have so much more information in them. So I can actually take the exposure way down on this file, and you'll see that I haven't clipped any of my highlights. There's no white across the image. It means I have all of the colors still preserved in the file. So that'll mean I can get those colors back. If you've clipped them and you've just got a bunch of white when you take the exposure down, well, you're going to have a really tough time. I would suggest taking a better photo, finding a better one to work with. So that's my first tip. Use RAW when you're actually capturing the photo, and make sure you don't clip any of your highlights whenever possible. That's going to make it way easier to edit and get the right colors in the image. All right, that's my first tip. Second tip is do not use a preset. So I've got all of the Signature Edits presets here on my left, and I'm going to show you that every single one is going to look like garbage on this sunset photo. And that's because presets just generally don't look good on sunset photos. Why? Because most of the time when you've got a preset that's optimized to make sure that skin doesn't look oversaturated or that the blues aren't too blue, they're going to wind up making your sunset photo look just really washed out and nasty. Even though these presets work amazingly well on other things, sunset photos in general, just do it yourself, and we're going to go through that now. So that's my first and second tip. Make sure you're using a raw file, don't clip anything, and make sure you're not using presets. Just going to make things easier. I guess that's 3 tips. Okay, without further ado, the first thing that I would suggest is flatten the image as much as possible. You want to get all your highlights back. You want to take your shadows up. This is going to look kind of weird. We're going to add some contrast later on selectively in the tone curves and other panels. So I'm just going to raise the blacks, taking the whites down, shadows up, highlights down, contrast down. Okay, that looks really weird, right? But what that's going to allow us to do is add some dehaze. So I'm going to take that up just a little bit. Not too far. I don't want it to look like ridiculous, but somewhere around there. And then a little bit of vibrance and a little bit of saturation. Now, you might be wondering, what's the difference between vibrance and saturation, Ryan? I'm glad you asked, fine sir, madame. Vibrance takes up all of the colors, but tries to maintain the oranges, the yellows, and the reds. So what that means is it's going to bring a lot of saturation into the blues, but it's not going to bring much into the oranges and the reds. And the reason is vibrance is meant to maintain skin tones, so it isn't going to oversaturate your skin tones, it'll just saturate everything else. Whereas your saturation is going to bring up the saturation equally across everything. So if you're in a situation where you want to make sure everything has saturation added, go with the saturation slider. If you want to make sure you keep the oranges a little bit less saturated, go with the vibrance. So here's with the vibrance up, you can see the blue is very saturated, the oranges have been left alone mostly. They're a little more saturated, but not a lot. Whereas with the saturation, it's kind of the opposite problem. Our oranges are way too saturated and the blues aren't saturated enough. So we can try and find a blend here. We'll saturate the blues to a kind of normal amount and then saturate the oranges and the reds to about maybe there. So here's our photo before and here's after. So we've brought a lot of color back. It looks weird in HDR, but we're going to worry about that in our next step, which is the tone curve. So head into that tone curve. I'm going to go just to my normal straight up and down tone curve. If this is confusing for you, just watch my tone curve tutorial, because I have a full dedicated video. Oops, let's go to our point curve that walks through exactly how all this works. But essentially, we're just going to add some contrast by lowering down the shadow areas, by raising up the highlight areas. So we're kind of undoing what we just did. And I'm going to add one more point here in the midtones. And we can just play with that a little bit, try it up like that. Okay, now you can see we've added way too much saturation. but it's not as flat. So here's before the tone curve and after. We've just added some contrast, right? So I'm going to go back, tweak the basic panel. We'll take our vibrance down a little bit, maybe our saturation down a little, and our blacks down a little, whites up a little. I don't want it to look like it's too edited. We're just adding a little bit at a time. Well, I mean, we added a lot of it, but what you got to think about when you're editing photos in general is it's not about finding one slider and jacking that all the way up, and that just does it for you. It's about making little incremental improvements to your image, 5% at a time, 10% at a time. And after you go through this whole panel, you have a really cool photo. It's definitely going to be much better to make these little subtle edits than it's going to be to try and do everything on one panel. So anyways, back to our tone curve. We've done a basic contrast adjustment. This is called an S curve because apparently it looks kind of like an S. Personally, I don't see it, but you do you. If you see an S, great. Leave me a comment below. And if this video has been helpful at any point, do me a favor, leave a comment and hit that like button. Okay, so next up, I'm going to add some reds to my image because sunsets are generally red. So I've gone to the red section of the tone curve, and we're just going to raise the reds, particularly in the highlights and the whites and midtones, I guess. We're raising the reds. So you can see we've now added a really nice kind of sunsetty vibe. We've added a ton of color to the highlights in particular of this image. Now I could actually grab this little point here and slide it back, and what that's going to do is it's going to remove the reds from the blacks and the shadows. But I don't really want to do that. I want everything to be kind of red. I am going to try that with the greens, and that's going to make things a little bit more kind of purpley-ish. And let's take the greens down in the highlights too, just see how we feel. So you can see you can go really, really crazy and add a ton of color this way. And it's going to feel a lot more natural making color adjustments like that for a sunset than it is to try and go up to our saturation and just bring that up to 100, right? Okay, so this is perhaps a little bit crazy. So let's just go back here. We're going to dial it back. Shoot somewhere around there. So we've added some nice contrast and some color to our sunset. I'm liking that. You might not want a purpley vibe to your sunset, so you could try playing around with the white balance or just warm it up a little bit. Now we're going to go down to our HSL panel, and there's a few things that we can do. We could try and go for an analogous, I'm not exactly sure how it's said, but an analog color palette, which is kind of monochromatic. You only have one sort of main shade and everything is built around that. And for a sunset, that can be really cool. So we're going to try and shift all the colors more towards each other. So the greens are the ones that really aren't standing out, that are standing out here right now. We've got some blues and some purples and some reds and some oranges. Those kind of blend together. But the greens, we can warm those up. That'll make them blend a little bit better. And then we can take our aquas and sort of see, of course, there's no aqua in the image. Not going to do anything. So we can try and play around a little bit there. I don't want to make the blues too purple because that's just ridiculous. So let's take a step back there. Maybe too much, somewhere around there. And then we can add a little bit of selective saturation if we want to. Let's just try with maybe our yellows. Honestly, I feel like I like it better actually down than up. So you can see, it's not like I have a select recipe of this is going to give you sunset perfection every time. It's just sort of playing around little by little, making these small micro adjustments until you're happy with what you got. Now, typically, the top of the sunset is more blue and things get warmer and colder down here. And our sky is looking maybe a little bit purple, right? So we could take our blues and just shift them a little bit more towards blue. And then a little trick that I saw once that I like. Somewhere on YouTube, I can't remember who. It wasn't me though. Take a graduated filter and shift it towards blue. You can see that's a really easy way to add blue to any section of your image, just with a graduated filter. And then if you actually drag it down like this, you make that transition more gradual. Graduated, gradual. Haha. Okay, so you grab that, make it much more subtle, and then we're going to raise up the whites so it just blends a little better. I don't know. You can try it like that. Or you can say this is nonsense and just move on with your life. I'm not really liking it in this particular image. We'll try it somewhere else. Anyways, so we've done that. We've gone through our HSL panel. Here's before and here's after. So we've kind of made some slight adjustments. I'm seeing a little banding in the image right here. I don't know if that's my Lightroom preview or if that's actually happening. So we're just going to back off the luminance of the blues. So we've adjusted things very lightly. Now we're going to go down, you can do your transform and add some sharpening and stuff like that. In this image, not really necessary, so I'm just going to leave that, not spend too much time there. But I'm going to go into my color grading panel, and we're going to add some more color. So again, this is where you can be completely creative. We can undo some of that purpley tint by just adding some color in the highlights, take it towards blue or green. And if you've never used this thing before, essentially the closer you are to the middle of this little circle thing, the less saturation you're adding. And then this outside thing is what color you're adding to that area. So we've got our highlights, our shadows, our midtones, our shadows, our highlights. That's embarrassing. And then we can take and add more or less color to that area of the midtones. So we can go and make our midtones super warm, maybe add some orange, something like that. We can go into our shadows and we could add some blue. And you can see you can get some really crazy effects and take it way too far, or you can be more subtle. I'm going to go with subtle here. I mean, it's not like this is a supernatural looking at it, but here's before, here's after. You can see we've made some pretty startling changes here. I think I've actually added a little bit too much warmth, so I'm going to dial that back a little too. Or maybe the opposite. I don't know. Just figuring it out, just like the rest of us. Nobody has all the answers. Okay, lastly, I'm just going into the calibration here and kind of messing around with our primary colors. If you have no idea what this calibration panel is about, then you can watch the calibration tutorial I have on my channel. Or if you have Lightroom CC, not Classic, you're not actually even going to have access to this panel. So that's one of the reasons I personally recommend Classic over CC. But if you don't have it, that's why. In case you're just really, really confused as to why my Lightroom looks so different. Okay, lastly, things are looking still a little bit, let's call it HDR. So we're just going to dial back this shadows a bit. Maybe raise the highlights a little bit. Pull the whites back because I don't want it to clip anything. Before, after, we've added some serious color to our image. And then just because I don't want things to be too contrasty, and I kind of feel like this would benefit from more of a film sort of vibe, film-esque, I don't know. If you take this little dot here on the tone curve and you double click it, it's going to create this straight line. And now what's happening is it's clipping everything below a certain point. So again, if you don't understand the tone curve, this is going to be a confusing explanation. But here we have our blacks on the far left and our whites on the far right. And then as we go up here, we're actually taking the black point and saying, okay, this black point isn't going to be true black anymore. The darkest the image is going to get is going to be this, whatever you set that dot to. So you can see we can invert it and make it ridiculous, or we could just raise it up and kind of give it that sort of filmic fade, if you will. So I'm just going to take that up a little bit like that. You can see here's before, here's after. And that, dear friend, is our finished image. Yeah, you might like it, you might not. But now you know kind of some tips to go ahead and edit sunset photos. So let's go through another couple. If this was helpful in any way, shape, or form, do me a favor, let me know how, and also how I can improve it in the comments below. Love to hear from you, and hit that like button. And make sure to share these images, tag @SignatureEditsCo so I can see your awesome stuff. So let's go through this one. Again, you can see if I take my exposure down, nothing is clipped, which is great. I know I can recover all these colors. And this particular raw file is just awesome to begin with. There's not a whole lot I have to do here. I could kind of engage in the same strategy, take our highlights down a little bit. I'm going to take the whites up a little bit this time. Just add a little more pop to the image. Blacks, we could take down. I personally don't really like that clipped look, but you can see that we've got this white sand beach that when we take the blacks up, it almost looks a little weird. So also, let's hide this so my screen's a little bigger. Should have done that earlier. Okay, so we've got our nice sandy beach. And if we want to just add some more saturation, obviously we could just take our vibrance. And the vibrance is going to do a good job of enhancing the purples and the blues in the image without adjusting the oranges and the yellows too much. You can see saturation, adjust the oranges and the yellows a lot more. Okay, somewhere around there, and honestly, it doesn't take much to take the colors in this photo and do something awesome because it's just a great photo. Not as much dynamic range, so it's not as hard. You don't have these super washed out areas. Okay, let us try a few things. We can take our tone curve and just for kicks, sort of experiment, we could try adding a little bit more contrast. So again, we're lowering the shadows by doing this. You can see that's making the shadows black. This is making them very light. So we can just add some contrast. And people often ask, why is it that you would adjust the tone curve then instead of just using the contrast slider? That's a great question. The reason is control. So with the tone curve, I can be very selective about what part of the image I want to add contrast to. Do I just want to make the highlights brighter and the shadows darker, or do I actually want to make the midtones darker, but I want to make the highlights lighter, or make the highlights darker too, right? So you can do some really creative different things that you can't do with just a contrast slider, which is just adding contrast, and you have no more control than that. The other thing is you have control over the individual colors. So I can take my reds, and if I want to raise the reds highlights, but I want to lower the greens highlights, well, I can do that. Whereas if you're just using contrast slider, you cannot. So we could go really crazy, make this completely purple, and then just pretend that this is good. Or we can undo all of that. I just double click to do that. We're going to take the greens and turn them down, and you're going to see you get a lot more pink in the sky. So here's before the tone curve, and here's after. So it just depends what you're going for. You might have liked that blue, in which case you can make sure to just add some blue into the highlights. So we get this really nice, dreamy cotton candy vibe. But always make sure, this is just a tip that I've learned over the years, and I'm still continuing to learn to this day, you never want to push things too far. As soon as your edit is just way too far, it looks cool to you because you've been looking at it for a long time and you're like, oh my gosh, more color, more saturation. But in reality, when you walk away and you look back at it a year later or a month later or even 10 minutes later sometimes, you just say, what was I thinking? I ruined a perfectly good photo. In general, you don't want it to look like something that could never exist in real life. Your eyes are really good at picking up when things don't look natural, so you don't want to push the colors too far. I feel like this probably could happen. We're still within the realm of normal, but I might have pushed it too far. I'm not really sure. We are going to take these shadows down maybe a little bit. Just a bit. And I'm going to try grabbing a brush for this one. We're going to go to the Add Texture and just see, this might look horrible, but add a little bit of texture to this lake and see if that makes it nicer or worse. I don't know, we've added some contrast, a little bit of sharpening. We could try adding some texture from the actual texture slider. Honestly, it probably gets rid of the dreamy effect. So I don't know. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Texture brush? No texture brush. Anyhow, that is pretty good for me. I think we've gone a little bit too far in the saturation, so I'll dial it back a little bit. But that is how I would approach that particular photo. If you're wondering about these adjustment brush presets, they come with any of the preset packs that you purchase from Signature Edits, or you can just pause the video and copy this texture brush. Feel free. And then what you would do is you'd make all these settings. You go down here to save current settings as new preset. You enter a preset, my new brush that I stole the settings on. Just kidding. It's not stealing if I give you permission. All right, I'm rambling. Next photo. Okay, so this one's going to be a lot trickier. Why? Because we've got a really big blown out sun there. So if I take my exposure down, that's exactly what I'm talking about. We've got this big white area. So the only way we're going to be able to make that look good is either by embracing it and kind of, just making it look blown out and kind of rolling with it, or adding some color. So we can actually go down to our color grading. Normally I wouldn't skip to this right away, but just to show you, we can go to our highlights. We can add some color, but it's not even going to show up on this area, because that is just pure white. It's pure blown out. So what are our options? Well, we can go into our adjustment brush, reset these settings, hold Alt, and that will toggle up this reset panel. Then I'm going to paint onto this white section. Paint, brush, I don't know what you call it. Hit O if you want to see where you've painted. I could delete that and do a better job just because, I have standards. So I'm going to put the auto mask on, and then I'm going to just click in this white area. And you can see, since I've pressed O, it's showing where I've brushed. And the auto mask is going to try and detect areas of contrast and just guess at what I'm trying to mask out. So it might give me a slightly better, more accurate mask. Sometimes it sucks. You just have to play around. So I'm going to do that, and then I'm going to blend it in and just pretend like I didn't do that to begin with. Okay, so in this particular mode here, we can actually go down to our color, this tiny little panel, hit this, and you have a select a color option. So we can select a color. Let's go with blue. And take our exposure way down, and you can see that we've added a little bit of blue onto that white area. So before it was white, now it is ugly blue. Hooray. So I can grab a color that makes sense now. So let's go with like a pinkish red, or maybe a warm sort of orangey. Take that saturation all the way up. Probably even more yellow because the sky is yellow. We're going to blend that by taking the exposure up a little bit. And now you can see instead of pure white, we've at least added some color. And if you wanted to, you could duplicate that. And now we've added a bit more color saturation. Okay, so we've added a little color. Now we have to make it look good. So obviously we're going to hold Alt, and that'll toggle to our eraser brush and just kind of erase the areas that don't need that added. Would I do this on every image? Absolutely not. Is it kind of a handy trick to know? I think so. If you agree, leave me a comment. Okay, so here's before and here's after. So we've just added some color, made it a little bit less obvious, I guess. And we could go in here and mess around forever and a day. But you kind of understand the approach. You could go ahead then and just duplicate this a couple of times. We'll add even more yellow to it. Figure it out. Get it the way you want it, and proceed to the rest of the image. So we're going to go through the same kind of steps. Take our highlights down. You can see now we've got a little bit more color going on. Take our shadows all the way up in this particular case. Let's grab our whites and just sort of play around, maybe there-ish. There's no perfect, I'm just sort of feeling it. And I don't even know what I'm looking for. I'm just trying to get it to look, well, get as much detail back without it looking completely like trash. I want it to look flat, like it's untouched, kind of grayish, but I don't want it to look way too ridiculous because even the tone curve can't fix it. All right, back to our white panel. Same kind of thing. You're going to see every Lightroom tutorial you watch, they're going to do the same thing in the tone curve. They drop the shadows, raise the highlights, midtones you can kind of play around with. In this case, probably around there feels good. You can see here's before, here's after, and here's before any edits, here's after. So we've got a lot of information here that we just didn't have before. Now, one thing that isn't so good is the way that the sky is gone. I'm not happy with that, so we're going to try and get it back using our graduated filter trick I showed you before. So this time, grab our graduated filter. If you grab this bottom line, you can adjust how graduated it is, so kind of around there. Take this dot, that'll grab it. If you press O, it'll show you kind of what you're working with in regards to how it blends and where it ends. So press O again, and now I'm just going to take our temperature down. You can see I'm adding some blue back into our sunset. Now another thing that I could do is go into our color. I could even add some more blue on top of it. I don't want to go too far here because it'll just feel weird. Somewhere around there maybe. Okay. Now looking at this, the whole photo, too bright. I'm going to take my exposure down a little, which is going to reveal that there's just too much saturation going on in the oranges and the yellows. So what can we do? Well, you can take your saturation down to fix that problem, but then everything gets too saturated or too desaturated. So then we take our vibrance, remember, because that doesn't affect the oranges and the yellows as much, and we can take that back up to balance. So we're just going to try and find a nice kind of middle ground here, somewhere around there-ish. Now, is this an example of a perfect edit? No, we're not even close. It's just giving you some ideas of what you can do to try and get that color back. So again, I think I went too far here on this graduated filter. I'm just going to dial it back a little bit, or maybe the issue is I'm making it too dark on the edge, so I could grab my contrast and bring it down. That's an option. Bring my whites up. That's another option. Or take my exposure up. In general, I go for the one that's going to be the least obvious, and exposure tends to be really obvious. Whites, when you raise them up, it's more transparent, I think. Or even the highlights, you could try adding some. Before, after. Okay, good. Cool, cool, cool. Next, I'm going to just do some general image housekeeping. We're going to go down here to our Add Texture brush and add some texture on said cactus because I think that's kind of the focal point of this image. And also add some texture. We'll do that on a separate brush in a second. Let's start with the cactus. So I'm going to brighten up the cactus a little. like so. Cool. That might be slightly too far, like that. I'm going to make a new brush here, again with the add texture, and we're just going to paint on this hill. So I want to add some contrast back to the hill because it's still not contrasty enough. Contrasty, you know what I mean. Then we're going to raise the highlights up, add some whites. So we're just adding the contrast back in there because we kind of overdid it when we took the highlights down and the shadows up over the whole image. So again, a lot of this is about just tiny little nuanced changes, one step at a time, one little improvement at a time. I think I might have over sharpened things here because we've got some weird sort of banding going on. So again, the further you take that effect on the adjustment brush, the more careful you have to be with the fact that if you overdo it, it's really going to show up unless your mask is really good. And since my mask is not good at all, just a really quick one, I can't push this too far. So let's just see what we can get away with. I'm going to press O so I can see my mask and just erase right around this line. Again, hold Alt and you will toggle between the brush and the eraser. Save you a lot of time. Going down to select the eraser or the brush just is not worth it. Trust me, that's one shortcut you should learn. If you want to know the other ones, I have a video on that too, so just look it up. Okay, and lastly, I am going to do a little bit more texture around this rock. I was going to say mountain. It is not that. And the foamy waves down here. Something like that. Raise the whites up on that area. Okay. So, is this the perfect photo edit? Absolutely not. I could mess around for days and days, but did I bring out some more color? Yeah. Did I recover some shadows? Yeah. Did I give you some good tips? Hopefully, that's for you to decide. Of course, we could go down here, we could mess around even further, take the luminance of our greens up if we wanted that cactus to pop more. Maybe go down into our color grading and add even more tonage to our image. Let's go with more of like an orangey yellow vibe this time. Not every photo has to be pink, Ryan. Something like that. Before, after. So we've really warmed it up. We've really warmed it up. That's the problem when I'm just talking and I have no script. Sometimes my verbiage gets a little bit confusing. Especially if English isn't your first language, I apologize. I apologize for giving you all these words that don't really exist. Okay, maybe raise the saturation just in the reds. That makes it look really not good, so undo that, Ryan. Before, after. And if you wanted to, that hill is just too dark or too light for you, we could of course go take our shadows down. That'll make it more natural. There you go. That is image number trace. Okay, this one we have another example of a photo that is very bright. This point is definitely blown out, as you can see. And because we've got a really hazy sky, there's not a whole lot going on in terms of color in this image. So we're going to have to add some if we want it. First, I like to take my exposure down. That shows me what I'm working with. There is some clouds here, but there's not a lot of color. It's honestly kind of gross. I don't know how this will turn out. I'm going to grab our exposure, take that down. I'm going to grab my highlights, take those down. Shadows, take those up. You can see a trend. Take the whites up a little bit because I don't want it to be too dark. And blacks, somewhere around maybe there-ish. Now, I don't know if I would bother editing this photo in depth because you can see this bird shows that the shutter speed was definitely really slow. Yeah, we're at 100th of a second. And I'm assuming since this was taken handheld, it's not going to be super sharp, but it's not bad. We should be able to make it work. Stop complaining, Ryan. First off, because the bird is blurry, we're just going to get rid of it using the spot removal tool. Again, it looks like there's a speck here we'll get rid of. Are there any others on this image? Not that I see. So let's move on to our tone curve, or maybe just our dehaze. See how that feels. I don't know, something like that. Now, this sunset, or the sun, is going to be kind of weird because you can see there's a really clear circle that just looks bizarre because it's blown out. So what I'm going to do to make that less distinct, we're actually just going to reset. I have a sun flare brush in here. We'll try that. This might not work at all. Yeah, that definitely does not work at all. Don't add a sun flare to a blown out sun. But I'm going to take my texture and my clarity down and my dehaze down. A lot of people never use this. You can, use this to dehaze, but you can also use it to kind of add haze back in. And in in my head, I don't know if this is going to work. It looks like it's not going to. In my head, I was going to get rid of that little circle, but it's a stubborn circle. Okay, something like that. Take our exposure down. Okay, I have no idea what just happened here. Let's try again. We're just going to go on here, take our texture, clarity, dehaze all the way down. Kind of just try and blend it together. Something like that. Add some warmth. Add some pink. And you can see, sometimes my ideas suck. That one just did not work. But I'm going to leave it in here because it just shows you. Even if you're new at this, those of us who've been using Lightroom for a while, editing photos for a long while, still get stumped sometimes. Okay, for now, we're going to come back to that. Let's just, hopefully we'll find some other way in the future. And you can see sometimes the photo itself, the raw photo you're working with too, is just stubborn and it's going to be really tough to get it to look good. If you don't start off with a good photo to begin with, not saying this is or isn't, but if you take a photo, everything is clipped or the composition isn't good, no amount of editing is going to fix that. Okay, let's just go crazy on this one. Let's add, let's try adding some green just to mix it up. We're going to add some green across the entire image. So I'm taking the black point up and the white point up. And so everything is having green added to it. Okay, now I'm going to add some red. And green plus red is sort of more of a yellow goldish result. So here's before and here's after. You can see it's warmed right up. Now we could do the opposite. We could take our blues down and that's going to make it even warmer. But it's also going to get rid of the blue in the mountain. And I don't know if I want to do that. I could add some blues back into the shadows. Like so. Here. Make another point like that. Add the blue to the shadows. Take the blue out of the highlights and you can see we've got a nice putrid sky. So if you ever wanted to know how to make your sky look like vomit, this is the tutorial for you. Hit the like button. Okay, let's go into our color grading, which again, if you don't have this panel, yours might just say split toning. It's the same thing, they just changed the interface. Instead of having two different sliders here that you can select a highlight and a shadow and then do a blend of the two, they just switched it to 3 different sliders. The highlights, the midtones, and the shadows, which I have to say is a lot easier to understand and explain. Okay, we're going to go for like a sort of westerny warm vibe. I don't know if that's what this is, but that's what we're calling it. Okay, there we go. So here's before, here's after. We kind of gotten rid of those blues. If you want to add some blue back into the top of the sky, we could grab our graduated filter, do the same kind of thing. Reset, hold Alt. Take our slider down towards blue. Maybe add some magenta so I don't look ridiculous. Something like that. And again, we can't darken it too much. So we're going to raise the whites as well. So here's before and here's after. We've just added a nice touch of blue at the top. Okay, before, after. Does it look good? I wasn't really happy with the photo to begin with, so I don't know. And that's just going to show you. I'm certainly not the world's greatest editor, just trying to share the stuff that I have learned along the way. And one of the things I've learned along the way is that sometimes things just don't work the way you want them to. Now, one thing we could try, just out of pure curiosity, is using a spot removal tool on the sun and replacing it with like this orange bit. We're going to go to clone. And then we're going to take our feather, turn that all the way up. We might be onto something, but it's not something good. You can mess around. If you come up with a better idea, please let me know. Let's try one more, but this time, instead of it just being pure white, I think that's the issue, we'll take it up to this really white area of sky. And we're going to try and find one that sort of blends in. There we go. Blend it. I mean, at least it gets rid of that super clipped looking circle in the middle, but it's definitely not good, hey? If you have a better idea, please, for the sake of me and everybody else watching this video, leave it in the comments below. What would you do to fix said sun? I could brighten that whole area. I don't know. We're going to move on because life is short. Okay, this one, beautiful photo. I believe that's Mount Fuji. honestly, I'm not smart enough to know. Okay, that with just the contrast, I think is beautiful. If you want to add maybe some more blues to the blues, we could try just increasing our vibrance here, decrease our saturation to compensate, and that looks sort of ridiculous. So we're going to undo that. Another option, of course, we could paint on here with our adjustment brush. This really has nothing to do with the blues anymore, but I think if we add some texture to those clouds, it'd be really cool. Make them pop and just feel a little more alive. And then I'm also going to do the same thing down on the mountain. The one thing about this photo is that because there's a cloud on top of it, the mountain itself is very dark. So we could just go in here, brighten up the mountain just like that. Just kidding. The easiest way to brighten something without being super careful about the mask is just take the contrast down and the whites up. So what you're doing is you're lowering the contrast, and that's brightening the shadows, I guess. I don't know how this works. I just really like it. It's a magical technique. Take the contrast down, take your whites up, and you can see that it brightened everything, but it wasn't super, super obvious. And we don't have to be as careful with our mask. Like there's no fringing going on along the line of the mountain. Here's before, here's after. So we've brightened that up. That is definitely too far. And there are some areas of this mask we need to clean up. So we'll just zoom in, set my opacity on this eraser, or my flow, down a little bit. And I'm just going to remove a little bit from up there. And again, I'm not being super careful because I like to work fast. Normally I work much faster, but since I'm talking and trying to explain things, you know how it is. Okay, press O again. That looks all right. We're just going to erase the part of the cloud that I brightened up. Okay. So here's before, and here's after. We brighten that. We're going to maybe add a little bit more texture. We could try that, see how it feels. Feels okay. Maybe add some dehaze. Maybe, maybe not. I think just adding some more white will make it pop a little bit. Raise the highlights. That'll do it even more. So we're adding selective texture rather than just doing it with the contrast slider here. Okay, and then let's try maybe even a little clarity. It depends what kind of a vibe you're going for. Are you going for like a more dreamy sort of feel, in which case you'd really want to take the texture down on everything and make it sort of feel more filmy? Sometimes that's really cool. Or you can even take the clarity down and the dehaze up. That can kind of give you a nice pop to your image, make it really interesting and just different. Before, after. So we've added some nice color. We've really brought out the texture in that cloud. We could brighten things up a little bit more just for the overall exposure. And then because we're sort of clipping this area up here, clipping's maybe a strong word, but it's too bright. Then we go in here with our adjustment brush and we will actually do a range mask just for something different. So I'm going to really sloppily paint in here. You can see I've done a horrible job. If I press O, and eventually it'll show up. Lightroom is not cooperating. There we go. So I've done a very sloppy job, but that's okay. Because if I go down here to the range mask and press luminance, I can go, okay, the color range, or the brightness range, that's what luminance means, brightness basically. And we take that, so it's only adjusting things that are between 82 to 100 in brightness. So the brightest areas of the image, that's the only thing that these effects are going to go on. And when we do that, hopefully that didn't reset my luminance for mask. No. Okay, now I can grab my exposure. You can see only the brightest areas are being darkened. Really easy way to get a nice accurate mask. Good, and if we wanted, we could add some blue back to the sky. Just depends what you're feeling. Maybe add some pinkish blue. I think that's a little far. Something like that. That's feeling okay. Now, these little clouds floating around in the sky, I personally think don't add to the composition. They're kind of distracting. So I'm going to get rid of them using our yellow spot removal tool. Side note, if you hold shift, you can adjust the feather in your brush / spot removal. And because we've got a really blue, really easy to mask out sky, I don't need to worry about having it super feathered. I'm going to switch it to heal instead of clone. That'll just tend to do a more consistent job of removing these little dots. And because I'm on an old 2015 MacBook Pro, You're going to have to wait as I do this very slowly because Lightroom likes to think. Okay, we're not going to be too fussy because I don't want you to be here forever, but that is that. I'm thinking it's pretty good. The last thing that I might do is make one more adjustment brush down on here and just brighten up the whites on the snow because I feel like it's still a little dark down here. So we'll reset that whole brush, grab my highlights, bring those up, and my whites, bring those up. Not much is happening. There we go. Something like that. So here's before, here's after, and of course we could do a million other things that we did in our other images. We could go down to our color grading. We could say, okay, the highlights, we've got some nice blue sky. Let's add some more blue to it. Take that over there. And maybe our shadows, we're going to do just pink this time. Dial that back. Or maybe we could go with more of an orange. Now you got to be careful because if you take, let's say that the shadows normally are just sitting and they're kind of more blue and then you go towards yellow. Mixing the opposite color is not going to add more color. It's really just going to cancel those colors out. So you can see that now we've kind of gone gray in this sky, whereas before we were nice and saturated because it was all blue. So you want to add something kind of in the range of what it already is, or adjust your hue and saturation, I suppose, in the HSL panel. Okay, and then our highlights. I don't know what we want to do in the highlights, maybe just more red. Every single sunset photo I do apparently is red and pink, so let's just embrace it. Let's leave the highlights alone, honestly. Okay, that's that photo. We've got before and after. Hide these presets again. Shabam! I should say, if you want some free presets, head to signatureedits.com. You can download some there as well. They won't work on your sunset photos, but they're good for everything else. Okay, this one, another example of a photo that just has no natural color in it. So we're going to be very limited with what we can do here. If you want, you can take your temperature down. Getting your white balance right often is the most important step because you can see when we take it towards green and towards yellow, all we get is this like orangey sunset, which might be what you're going for. Or if we take it towards blue and towards pink, then at least we get more of that blue and pink. And because we know that apparently that's the only color of sunset I do, let's roll with that. So I'm going to go in here, I'm adding a radial mask, and in this one I might be able to get away with adding a fake sun. So we're going to go with our sun flare subtle. And all this really is doing is lowering the contrast. It's simulating a sun flare by lowering the clarity, adding some dehaze. We can add some warmth, maybe get some texture out of there and brighten it up, something like that. So we've kind of simulated both a lens flare and a sun flare, which is the same thing. Jeez. Sometimes I need to think about what I say before it just comes out. Okay, so we're going to try and add some warmth into this sun flare. Good. Let's take our highlights down. I don't want to blow things out. I just want to add some warmth. Take our pink out of there because it's too pink. I know. You're not used to hearing me say that, but... Okay, so here's before and here's after. We've made some progress, depending on what you like. We've either made progress or I've ruined the photo for you. Highlights up, shadows down. Add some contrast. In our basic panel, we could see what things are like if we raise up the shadows a little bit. Actually, that's kind of cool when you can see more of the photo. Good. Take our highlights down. Give us more color back. Whites up. Maybe not. We kind of have to be careful about this sunspot, not taking it too far that looks ridiculous. And our blacks up like that. Okay. Now, I would like to have more color in this image. How do I do that? Well, there's a few ways. Obviously, we could go into our tone curve. We can mess around here, add some reds to the shadows. I think let's keep the shadows, honestly, even more of a green tone might be sort of cool. So let's see if we can add some green to the shadows. And I'm just adding a second point here. This line, this dark one, just signifies kind of neutral, not adding any of that color. So everything else is along that line. It's just the darkest parts, the blacks, that I've taken and raised up a little bit. So something around there. Reds, we're going to do something similar. Just want to warm it up in the shadows. Here's before. Here's after. And it depends. Do you want more of like a kind of soft vintage vibe, or do you want it to be more like that? I don't know. I do not know. Or we could go really crazy. Let's actually just go with what we had. Kind of liked it better before. That's the process. Just give yourself time, experiment, figure out what works, what doesn't work, what looks good, what looks awful. Generally, just raising the saturation doesn't look good, but sometimes it does. So have a try. Take our yellows. I'm going to shift those more towards orange rather than towards green. That'll blend things in a little bit more. And what I really want to do is go down to our color grading. I'm going to go to my highlights, and I'm going to add some reds and oranges into those. Shadows. Let's just see what feels good. Something around there actually feels kind of cool. Good. Midtones, lots of ways we could go. Pretty much just pick whatever color you like. I'm thinking more of that yellow. So here's before, here's after. Maybe darken it down a little bit. And then the one thing that I'm not really loving is how dark this kind of rail structure is. I'd like to brighten that specific area a little bit. So we're going to do another range mask. Reset this brush. Just brush in the area I'm going to try and brighten up. This might work, or it might be an epic fail for you all to watch and laugh at me. I'm going to go to luminance. This time we're going to take our range and just have it in the lowest area, 0 to 27. So it's only going to target the blacks and the shadows. I'm going to take my exposure just to test and see if my mask looks good. Okay, looks okay. So it is masking out the right area, but it's going to be way too blue, so we're just going to counteract that by adding some yellow and maybe add a little pink. Take our exposure back down now. Okay, there we go. Take our contrast down, our whites up. Perfect. That looks reasonably natural. Here's before, and here's after. I've probably taken it a little bit too far, so my advice for you, if you think you've got the right amount, just dial it back by 10%. You'll probably be better off. Okay, that's good. Now, one last thing. The corners of this image, pretty dark, so we could go down to our transform. Nope. When you forget where things are in Lightroom. Definitely it's going to be in lens corrections, you silly guy. Go to profile, enable, and Lightroom is probably going to, there we go, just brighten things up. And our vignette, I'm actually going to take this up. Hello. You can see it's brightening up the corners of the image a little bit. Now, very last of all, if I zoom in, this whole image looks and feels a little bit soft. So I'm going to start by just doing some sharpening. I'm going to take our sharpening way crazy up because I just find it easier when I can see it really well. If you hold down Alt, you get this overlay. You can grab your radius and just see how it's affecting the image, and it just shows up a little bit easier. And then our masking, I'm going to do the same thing. Hold Alt, and now as I drag this up, it's sharpening less and less of the image. A lot of this image I don't need to sharpen. For instance, the sky or the area that has nothing going on. So that's why you can get away with adding more sharpening, because you're not sharpening everything, just a little bit. You can see we've got this really weird sort of banding going on where these tiny little fine lines are. That's because our radius is too high, probably. So if I dial that back, it'll make that less noticeable. Or we could try taking our masking up further so we're not going to be sharpening it anymore. Maybe, maybe not. Find what works. Okay, that's feeling better. The last thing is I want this train to really sort of stand out and be nice and sharp. So let's just grab one final brush here. And I don't mind that the back of it is dark. I kind of think it's cool. But what I do mind is that it's just not popping. I want it to pop. So we're going to take our texture up. Maybe even try clarity up a little bit. Even a little dehaze. And we could brighten it very slightly because it, to me, is the focal point of this image. You can see how bad my mask is. So let's just make that a little better. Of course, when you're editing this photo for yourself, take your time. Don't be so sloppy. Okay. Something like that. Contrast down, whites up. Easiest way to brighten something without it actually needing really, really accurate mask. Okay. And now I'm really liking this photo. Before, I thought it was ugly and I didn't want to edit it. Now I think it's actually kind of cool. But I can tell by flipping back and forth between the before and after, I've taken things too far. So let's always make sure we dial things back from what we think looks great. Something like that is probably a lot more lifelike and is just going to feel better. There it is for your viewing pleasure. Wait for it. There you go. So, I think at this point you pretty much understand my methods here. Again, if we want to add some color to the image, it's going to be more tricky than if the photo already has it. This one, let's take our blacks up. I'm having fun. You can feel free to tune out at any point and go edit these photos for yourself, or you can just keep watching. I don't really care. I'm just going to keep going. So I'm going to add some texture to this image. No, that feels really weird. I'm just going to selectively add it to the mountain. Okay, I'm going to dehaze a little bit. Something like that. Okay, we've gone really far with, highlights all the way up, shadows all the way up. Let's try taking our highlights down, actually, because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We can brighten the whole image now. So here's before, and here's after. So you can see we've already got a lot more color happening in the sky. Everything looks really flat and kind of weird, but we fixed that in stage 2. Let's add a little bit of this. Don't want to take it too far. Somewhere around there. Okay. Tone curve. Oh, I'm in the greens, but honestly, I kind of like that. So let's maybe just dial that back. We'll come back here. We're just going to go to our main tone curve. Add some contrast with that S curve. You got it. You know what's going on. And you can mess around. You can experiment with different curves. Try some different stuff. I'm just going to keep it basic here with a standard add contrast curve. Before, after, you can see we've added a ton of beautiful color to our image. Maybe, just maybe, let's try not adding so much pink this time to the highlights. So grab our greens, and around the highlights we're going to pull her back. Okay, before, after, just with a tone curve, down to our HSL. I kind of like these blues, but I think that they're not bright enough, so we're going to take our blues and brighten them a little bit. And brighten the colors next to the blues as well. I find in general when you make changes to your HSL, grab the slider and the sliders next to it, kind of do one of these, it'll blend better. You don't always have to do that, but it's kind of a rule of thumb. Makes it a little bit less obvious that you've adjusted one color if the ones beside it are adjusted as well. Okay, so we've added a little blue to the sky. I really like the color on this mountain, but I don't like the shade of it. So we're going to take our reds and just see if we can make it more orangey. See what happens. Take the oranges. Yeah, there we go. I don't know. What do I want? The real question of life. What do you want? Okay, let's go with that. We've got too much saturation going on in the oranges, I think. Okay, before, after. We're adding some nice color. We still need some more contrast. We'll get there. Let's go with our color grading. Okay, I really like that shade of pink. Which shade of pink should I make this sunset? Okay, let's try something totally out of the usual. Let's go with our midtones being really nice and warm this time. And of course, you're also limited by the colors in the actual photo itself. If the photo was blue and you're trying to make it orange, you're going to have a hard time making that look normal and natural. It's just going to feel wrong. Got to roll with it. Okay, so we could kind of go for a blue vibe. We could desaturate everything else and make it just a blue sunset. That might feel kind of weird. Okay. And I should also say, just because these tools are here, doesn't mean you have to use them in every single photo. Sometimes it's better just to leave it. Sometimes the photo looks amazing. Feel free to walk away and just say, that's beautiful, I'm done. Okay, let's go to our calibration. I feel like we're going to be able to do some interesting stuff here. Okay, don't want to take this too far, but a little bit. Something like that. Take our blues, just tinker for a second. We could go like really unreal. Go for that orange and teal look. Again, I'm literally just messing around. There's no specific strategy there. In case you're taking notes, there's no magic numbers. I'm just sort of messing around, seeing what looks good. Sometimes that's fun. Other times it's good to have a technique and say, okay, I'm pretty much going to add an S-curve. I'm going to add some color, and that's my method. So let's add a little bit more contrast to this image. Maybe not in the shadows so much. Something like that. Okay. Lastly, we're just going to do an adjustment brush Now this lake is intentionally very glassy and beautiful, so I don't want to mess with that too much. But what I could do is maybe make it a little bit brighter and add some saturation to it. Before, after. Okay, these trees are kind of weirding me out. We could try taking our shadows down, that'll fix that. And then the mountain, I want it to kind of stand out a little bit more. So we're going to grab a brush, brush like so. You can see, very sloppy brush, but if we're just doing some contrast down, you can see just adjusting the contrast will make things appear brighter. Good. I'm going to add some texture in there, not too much though, just a little, I don't know. And I actually don't think I need to add it down here, so I'm going to erase that section of the brush. Really, the focal point of the image is right here, so that's what I want to focus on sharpening up a little bit. Good, and raise the whites up. And of course, the further I go with this, the more careful I'm going to have to be about the fact that now you can see my mask was sloppy. So let's zoom in. One method we could do is our range mask, or we could go in the old-fashioned way. Just clean it up. Again, I'm just holding Alt. That'll let me switch between my eraser and my brush. And I've got my settings here. My flow is down quite a bit. That way I can make really subtle, gradual changes as I go back and forth. Of course, my really subtle is not always super subtle, so... Okay, you can see, still very bad mask. Down here in particular. That's why I like going with really subtle changes when possible. That way you don't have to be so careful. Okay, before, after, it might be a little far anyways, so we'll dial that back. And I want it to be maybe warmer, maybe, and a little bit more pinkish. Again, get what you think is right, then dial it back because you've probably taken it too far if your name is Ryan, and you are me. Good. Lastly, this sunset, I think we could really bring out the colors a bit more, specifically in the sky. So we're going to do a really sloppy brush here with a range mask, a luminance, or we could even tune it to color, but we'll try luminance again. Grab our range and make it just the brightest parts of the image. Press O so we can see what we're editing. Perfect. You can see it's masked just the brightest parts of that sky, which is good. So I'm going to try taking our white balance towards blue and pink. And you can see we're adding some blue and pink to the sky. That's one method. Of course, we could also go here to our saturation. Try adding just a little bit and brighten things up a little as well. Okay, here's before. Here's after. You can see we've added a lot of color to that sky and to the photo overall without it making it look too edited. Now one last thing you could do is just get the dynamic range right. You can see if we look at our histogram, we really don't have any pure whites in the image, which means we can push things a little further before we start clipping stuff. So I'm just going to take this white. You can see the whole thing is going to move up. Yeah, take it around there. Blacks, we've got lots of blacks, so I don't need to make that any darker. Now, of course, this is just a tool. It's not something that has to be perfect or every time you have to have this go all the way up to white. But sometimes it can just be an easy way of saying, okay, I can get away with raising my highlights and my image will feel more natural if it has more contrast. Because again, we want to simulate what this would look like to the naked eye. And your eye would see things bright. Everything wouldn't be just really dull. So this is looking okay. I'm going to give myself a 7 out of 12 on that particular photo attempt. I'm not super happy with it. I'd probably keep messing around, but just giving you some ideas to work with. All right, let's do this one and then we're done, I promise. So I'm going to warm this up. I'm going to take my shadows all the way up, my blacks up quite a bit, my whites down, highlights. Yeah, you can see how much detail there is in the sky that I can get back. But we've also got some really weird, I don't want to call it fringing, but something funky going on around his ears. So we're not going to be able to get away with pulling that back too far without addressing that. So let's take it maybe around there. Here's before, here's after. I've just made it look really rubbish. Now we're going to go down to our tone curve. Try messing around, add that contrast back in here. Something like that. Here's before, here's after. That's what the tone curve is doing. Good. So you can see we've added some nice pop to the image. We've got more color going on. Go down real quick to our color grading. And once you have kind of the method down, you can see that you can really get some cool effects without it having to take an hour per photo. I was just really taking my sweet time explaining some things, but it doesn't have to be so involved. I'm not going to add much color to the shadows. I just don't really like it. But I will see what messing around in the midtones is going to do for me. I like that. So we've added some nice color to the midtones, kind of expanded that dynamic range. Looks good. Lastly, I think I'm going to just add some texture, make things pop a little bit. And then I want to brighten up the waves down here. So let's go here, reset. Good. Contrast down, whites up. You can see that really just makes it pop. We could add some sharpening, but that might also make it look just too weird. So be careful. Good. We could extend that to the sky and see what happens. And it looks horrible, so let's not worry about that. The last thing I'm going to do is just brighten the whole image a little bit, somewhere around there. Okay. I think somewhere around there is good. A good note to end on. So hopefully this has been helpful. If it was, well, great. Leave me a comment below and make sure to hit the like button. Grab the free raw files at signatureedits.com in the free raw files page, and you can edit along or you can just edit on your own. I don't care. Choose your own adventure. If this wasn't helpful, well, you probably didn't watch all of this, but I apologize. Leave me some tips in the comments below. Sound good? Okay, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and have a great day. Create something awesome. Peace.